This is World Studies. In case you forgot what class you were in, 7th grade students, this is the first video of week 5. Week 5. So hopefully you've turned in your week 4 packets. Hopefully you kept on to your chapter 18 notes. You still needed them, so hopefully you didn't turn those in. And we are picking up with Roman numeral 3, the consequences of the war. What war? World War II. So the plan is to finish the notes today. No one thought a war could be as deadly or as destructive as World War I. But just like many Hollywood movies, the sequel was worse than the original. Letter A, long-term consequences for society. After World War II, European society was crushed. For centuries, European culture was the dominant culture in the world. England, France, Germany, and others had boasted the strongest armies, the wealthiest economies, and the most advanced centers of learning. Over time, Europe had rejected its Christian heritage and embraced humanism and nationalism. Now, the two centers of the world had shifted to the U.S. and the USSR. Number 1, the beginning of the atomic age. First, the U.S., and then the Soviet Union acquired the technology to build atomic weapons. As we may recall, the U.S. had used them against Japan to end World War II. Germany had been researching this technology before they were defeated. When the Soviets moved into Germany, they captured many of these scientists. They also had spies in the U.S. to gain more information. By 1949, the Soviets also had atomic weapons. The development of atomic weapons affected the strategy of future wars. The fact of the matter is, since World War II, total war is no longer an option because that could result in global destruction. If one country shoots off atomic weapons at another country, the other country responds in kind, and that could possibly wipe out, civilization as we know it around the world. Also, man discovered that scientific and technological developments are not always good. Number 2, the beginning of the Cold War. What is the Cold War? The Cold War is the political rivalry that stops short of actual war. If we were to, term World War I, World War II, we would call those hot wars because fighting actually took place in those wars. But a Cold War is a rivalry that stops just short of actual war. It took place between the U.S. and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies. Well, why didn't the two countries just fight it out and get it over with? Because of what we just mentioned. Atomic weapons could possibly destroy the world as we know it. After the war, it became apparent that the Soviets sought to spread communism around the world. Russia had taken control of Eastern Europe as the Germans fell back during the war, and after the war, Russia sought to spread its influence even further. Next chapter, we will go into greater detail about the Cold War. Sometimes the Cold War did spark into hot battles, but we'll talk about that next chapter. Number 3, disillusionment. The fact of the matter was, there was a sense of hopelessness and despair which continued after World War II. Post-war literature and art reflected the view that life has no meaning or purpose. An example of this hopeless and despair feeling was a style of painting called abstract expressionism. This style became popular during this time. Jackson Pollock, he was an American painter who developed this style. He created many of his paintings by splashing wet paint on the canvas with brushes. And at the time, during this post-war era, that was considered art. Maybe I did have an art future. Who knows? Other artists expressed their hopelessness by writing stories or plays that demonstrated the meaninglessness of life. For example, Albert Camus wrote stories dealing with absurdity. He reasoned that people value what is meaningless since all people value their life, even though all die. Number 4, economic changes. The European nations will lose their overseas empires and their world power status. Britain, France, and other nations lost their empires as well as their global economies. Number 5, political changes. As Europe's influence declined, only 2 political powers remained. We've already mentioned this, the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Europe would merely side with one or the other of these political camps. Number 6, we also see a return to materialism. What is materialism? It's desiring things more than anything else. Fearing atomic war and death, people sought to find temporary comfort by seeking and enjoying the benefits of material wealth. This view existed after World War I and had grown in the 1920s. The Great Depression limited its influence, but it rebounded after World War II. So there was a return to materialism. Desiring things to find comfort. Does that sound familiar to us today? I definitely would think so. Letter B, philosophical and religious consequences. World War II destroyed the false philosophy that man is born without sin. After all, if man could cause this much death and destruction and evil around the world, how could people believe that man is born sinless? Well, many could not explain why there is so much hate that would lead to the death of millions. And of course, they weren't going to go to the Bible to find the answer. Number 1, philosophical consequences. During World War I or before World War I, people had an idealistic view. Idealism is the idea that things are only getting better. Well, they rejected idealism for another idea called relativism. The idea that truth and moral values are not absolutes, but they vary with each person. So the idea is, what's right for you is not necessarily right for me. What's wrong for you is not necessarily wrong for me. Don't judge me for how I live my life. I make my choices, what I choose to do for me. As long as it doesn't affect anybody else, I'm perfectly able and willing to do. Again, does this philosophy sound familiar to the mindsets of people today? I would say definitely. Another view that became popular at this time, philosophical view, was called existentialism. It's the philosophy that encouraged free choice and accepting consequences. This goes hand in hand with relativism. This view is the dominant view in American culture today. It denies the idea that God rules over the affairs of men. It denies the existence of a moral code defining what a human being is or should be. People are to choose a course of action that seems right to them and then strive to be faithful to that selection. Existentialism. How many of you believe that you have the right to make any choice you want as long as you're willing to face the consequences? Well, that's wrong. That is a wrong philosophy. That's existentialism. Because after all, choosing what your moral code is not dependent upon you. Rather, it should be dependent upon God's word. Rejecting God led to World War II. And instead of returning to God, they made themselves their own God. Number 2, religious consequences. In Europe, Christianity declined. The religions that claimed man was basically good were debunked. Atheism grew, churches emptied, many Jews struggled to believe in God after the Holocaust, and even some prominent theologians concluded that God was dead. In the U.S., Christianity continued to thrive. Many World War II veterans returned home after experiencing the devastation of the war. They went to a Christian college and desired to spread the gospel around the world. Turn in your textbooks, please, to page 344. I want you to read the purple box entitled GI Bill. Once you have finished reading that box to yourself, please unpause the video and we will continue. Perhaps some of your grandparents or great-grandparents were given the GI Bill to help them go to college. Maybe your grandparents or great-grandparents were the first people in your family to go to college, because before that time, not everyone went to college. Only the wealthy went to college, but now the GI Bill allowed more and more people. And of course, to this day, just about everyone is recommended to go to school. Lastly, letter C, total war and its consequences. Total war had taken place in World War I. With improved technology, it became even more deadly and destructive in World War II. Number one, there was massive loss of human life. More than 50 million people died in the war. Populations in Europe suffered significant decline. Russia lost about 20 million people alone, and more than half of them were civilians. Worldwide, approximately 35 million of the 50 million were civilians who died from different causes, including bombing of cities, disease, murder by invading troops, and famine. Of course, probably the saddest period in World War II was the Holocaust. The Jewish people, they actually don't call it the Holocaust, they call it Shoah. This was Germany's attempt to destroy all of the Jews in Europe, and during this time the Holocaust, or the Shoah, had taken place. It is estimated that the Holocaust killed over 6 million Jews. Turn back in your books, please, to page 343. And I want you to read the purple box entitled The Holocaust Slaughter of the Weak and the Unfit. Once you have finished reading that box, please unpause and we'll continue. Number 2, massive destruction of property. The cities, industries, and infrastructure of Europe and Japan suffered almost complete destruction. While the cost of the war had been about $500 billion, the cost of rebuilding will be even more. That, my students, is the end of the notes. Remember, this was the first video for week 5. For your homework, I want you to do pages 151 and 152 in the activities book. That is a matching section on page 151 and a chapter review on page 152. This will be the first assignment for week 5. Over the next 2 days, I want you to review and then take your chapter 18 test. Then the last couple days, or last couple videos that we'll watch, will be the beginning of chapter 19. Hope you all have a good rest of the day. Be good, do good. Bye.